from the last recording, we've actually done quite a bit along the lines of what we talked about last recording.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at, my project for the past month has really been to unify Windows, Linux, and Mac in terms of having everything under the platform layer.
Yeah. Platform.c.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The history has been that we've used a kind of control interface, which has given a greater granularity, but actually all the platforms share the same kind of fundamentals associated with mouse and keyboard interaction, these kind of things.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
So over the past month, I've been moving everything more to the shared interface, which has slight subtleties associated with internal state management and things like that. But I got that completed through the month, and my view is now I can probably remove the control interface. I also probably will remove the command directory and absorb the graph.c into the kind of broader draw stuff. I might just still maintain it as graph.c, but move it into the GUI directory.
Okay.
The genealogy source,
Mm-hmm.
what's your sense with that associated with its kind of ongoing usage?
Well, I haven't really done anything with the genealogy stuff for a while, but my intention was to maybe do things like draw diagrams of it.
Mm.
And, not so much using it from the point of view of the ape's cognition, but just as a sort of reference, if you like. Just to do a bit of archaeology on the thing.
Yeah, I think it's still useful. I mean, I'm certainly not considering discarding it. I'm just interested in... I mean, I think it fits into a kind of... It has a kind of, being relationship. There's a kind of being-entity relationship there. So, I mean, that's my view of where it probably should sit, with probably some optimization accordingly. I mean, my view with the graph stuff is that there's a bit of a additional optimization that can go within that. And then I think there's probably a broader aesthetic discussion that needs to be had associated with how this information is actually shown.
Right. Well, my original thinking was to use any format that was out there for genealogy, so that I could maybe use an off-the-shelf program to produce charts in whatever format is the standard.
And yeah, we settled on the Mormon standard.
Is that probably lots of other people have thought about these things, and there are probably all sorts of standards for genealogy which I'm unaware of.
Yeah. The one we settled on, though, was the Mormon standard.
I didn't know it was anything to do with Mormons, but I just looked up genealogy formats and things like that, and that's what I came across.
Okay. I seem to recall having a conversation with you at some stage associated with it being a format that the Mormons used.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Very good, very good. It's interesting, actually. I'm going through my books currently quite critically to remove somewhere between a third and half of them. And one of the books in my shelf, along with my Noble Ape-related reading, is a book on Malay, as in, well, it's the language of Indonesia and Malaysia. It's called Bahasa as its root name. But the thing that struck me, and it came through the early development of Noble Ape, was that Bahasa has a very applied term usage. So, if you want to say plural, you'll just double it. If you want to say ice, it is water, rock. You need a subset of there is never, well, in some cases, obviously, there are specific terms, but when you don't have a specific term, you throw a group of words around what it is like, and you get roughly the right term. And it struck me that this was a programmable language.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an ongoing kind of discussion development associated with the Noble Ape language, as in potentially the spoken language, but also the thought language.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wondered if it was something that could be more easily codified, actually studying existing languages, or whether it was something that was probably better to do independently, particularly the mapping of the byte codes onto audio.
Right, yes.
So that was a book that I was in two minds about whether I discarded, whether it was an important book to have to keep that dream alive, so to speak, or whether it was something that I needed to discard. And I think the same is true with regards to source code. I use the same rules with regards to Noble Ape source code. I think the genealogy code had a lot of additional structure to it associated with outputting to the specific format. I moved some of that into the file handling io.c just because, XML formatting and things like that probably should be pushed down to that level. But whenever we encounter XML, so previously there was some discussion associated with a shared simulation interface that had an XML format to describe the phenotype, so at least you could draw things that looked like noble apes in another package potentially. But I pulled that out probably quite consciously about 18 months ago, and I'm wondering if the notion of genealogy in terms of the format of genealogy is independent of this one particular genealogy format.
Are you thinking of maybe turning the genealogy into an XML format?
Well, it's already in an XML. It's already in a low fiber XML format. And my interest is maybe turning it into a slightly higher fiber XML format, which means that you get more of the underlying structure in the XML rather than just kind of point. Actually, you're right. The genealogy, there are two formats. The Mormon one is not XML based at all, is it?
I think there's a slightly more modern version of it, which is XML.
Yeah.
But I think the original version is just plain text.
Yeah. No, you're right. So the XML was, I think, part of our own output. Anyway, I need to go back through the genealogy code, and I think breaking it from the graph code in the somewhat artificial command directory is part of that. But anyway, talking more about what was done. So another theme associated with getting all the operating systems to work well together is to put the various project files in. And I noticed you made a check-in today associated with removing the qt.pro file.
Yes. I just noticed that there are two Qt projects and they're exactly the same, so...
That's interesting, because you didn't update your source code then, because I actually removed the other one. So, yes, this was actually a problem. I can't actually combine your changes because you haven't updated your source code, but I had removed the other one officially from the source code, and then you removed the other one.
Right, okay.
So, I'm not going to... The other thing associated with that change that's relatively minor, but I can implement it, is the check on file reading. And the logic associated with file reading that I'd like to use is that the number of... The output from fread is the number of bytes that are read.
That's right.
You know the number of bytes, basically, that you want to read. There are certain circumstances where having less than the number of bytes you want to read should be okay. It just needs to be handled accordingly. But yeah, rather than checking the zero case, I think checking the bytes that you should read and then handle accordingly. So I'll rewrite that change today.
Right, yes. Because without any handling, you just get warning errors. Or warnings up on the screen. So.
Yeah, in fact, that's another thing associated with adopting Qt, is that it gives me a whole series of different warnings on the Mac implementation because it actually uses a far rawer version of Clang than Xcode uses, or it leaves Xcode, removes various warnings, whereas this hits Clang directly, which is actually very beneficial.
I use GCC a lot, and I noticed that it's often quite helpful to compile on multiple architectures because the version of GCC for ARM seems to be slightly different from the version on other architectures. And so you can see different warnings and different errors occasionally.
So one thing we did talk about that I did implement early on was changing the way that we use indicators.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't really done more on that. What it did was actually captured a few relatively subtle bugs. But I changed slightly the way that we handle indicators with the view that we can move more to what we discussed associated with specific named indicators and then the ability to combine and subtract indicators in a graphing format.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
But as we're still working through the graphs currently, I think that work is ready to be done, but it's probably not going to be done in the next few months. It's just ready to be done, basically.
Right, I see. Okay. Just a point to note, for these things waiting to be done, it might be a good idea to put them as issues on GitHub.
Yeah, I will actually. I need to embody them in those. One thing that I've been doing externally is trying to use the Noble Ape source to edit podcasts, and I spent a couple of months doing that, which caused some movement of the audio.c and various iterations through that. But I've hit so many roadblocks through that. In fact, it comes down to the AIFF format. Fundamentally, that was the main thing in restructuring how AIFFs are read and written to. That took so much time, and so many additional bugs came through that because it's not that there's a floating AIFF format, but there are many variations within it. And writing the code to handle those variations, plus the underlying output and all this kind of stuff, basically cost me way more time than actually just hand editing podcasts. So that project I've kind of put on a back burner and renormalized the Noble Ape source so none of that affected, for example, the spoken audio out. But that is also something which is kind of external to the project, but has manipulated the source through the week, through the month. The other thing that I changed was the weather issue. When Andy was on last recording, he mentioned an issue associated with the weather, and this was actually a legacy issue that I'd been tracking, but I invested maybe 3 evenings in it over the past month and fixed that. I then spent a good amount of time trying to actually get Andy a Windows build so he could test it. Which has also been a good portion of the month associated with finding my Windows machine that had died, installing Parallels and then a version of Windows on my Mac laptop. So I can now build all 3 platforms. I'm building the Linux one on Mac Native Qt currently, but I can go to Linux if I need to. It's just easier to load the Qt IDE on Mac rather than booting into Ubuntu. What other changes am I seeing here? Lots of small Windows-related changes. I mean, Windows has been the kind of distant client for the past few years, and obviously with your work on Linux and my work on the Mac. So I put in a number of changes on the Windows source just to get it more in line, although it isn't doing 3 Windows yet, but it will be doing it shortly.
Yes.
And I think that's about it associated with the past month.
Okay. Probably the biggest change that I made was just adding a sort of prototype skeleton.
Ah, yes.
Nothing is hung on it yet, but I've got plans to flesh that out a bit and add some blood vessels and the like to demonstrate the vascular system.
Yeah, I think certainly Mike in LA, our I don't know, our user, our participant, our muser who works with The Simpsons, was particularly interested in that, and I am too.
If you wanted to really go to town on something like that, you could turn it into like a 3D model and do lots of very elaborate artistry on it. But at least for the beginning, I think 2D visualizations are good enough to get an impression of what's going on.
It's interesting, actually, because certainly on the Mac version, OpenGL is run above. I mean, basically, in order all the Mac window interfaces have OpenGL by default. You can't change that. And I was looking at the Polygon code in particular with that in mind, that if there was a Polygon translation layer straight to OpenGL, then you would get various optimizations, but when you wanted to flick the switch and move it to 3D, you would have one less barrier for entry. But at the same point, I also understand what you're doing with the code currently, and I think certainly in the short term, as you flesh out, for want of a better pun, the Noble Apes accordingly, then yeah, I mean, obviously it's fine as it is currently.
Yeah. Plus, I think with 2D, probably the metabolism might look better as more of a sort of systems diagram rather than something which looks literally realistic.
It is an interesting kind of compare and contrast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the realism element is still an important part, otherwise you wouldn't do it in the kind of skeletal way that you've done it. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing that develop, and I've realised actually through the month that it's not something... I mean, it's something that you'll basically be almost exclusively working on, because it's not something I can really interact with in terms of, I don't want to mess anything up for you, basically.
Okay.
I tried through the month doing premature optimization on some of the code and then basically just removed all those changes when it didn't work. So, yeah, my view is that, this is certainly a standalone project for you to work on, Bob.
Right. Potentially, some of these things could maybe even be sort of little standalone simulations in their own right.
Certainly.
Maybe you might want to simulate some other kind of creature, perhaps, and just have a sort of module that you can load in.
Yes, I mean, I think that's certainly, in the Origin of Mind chapter, that's certainly the way that I portrayed the simulation. And I mean, to a certain extent, historically at least, that was the case, that you could turn off the various components. There are now components that are so heavily intertwined, however, that it's actually quite difficult to remove them coherently. I did try through the month to remove the brain, and previously I'd been able to do this through FDEFs, but there have been problems more recently, particularly associated, I think, with the episodic memory, and there are various other things that are kind of interlinking through that now, which I've tried to put in some changes to split apart, but the way that I turn the brain off currently is just that there are, of the mathematics that creates the brain, there are certain constants where it will mean no brain activity, and I just explicitly check for those constants, and then no brain activity occurs. So yeah, that's the way that I'm turning off the brain currently, but it is slightly suboptimal associated with this idea that yes, each of the components should be removable, and I think ultimately that's part of unit testing as well.
Yeah, so thinking about that further, I mean, it might be nice to have some sort of interface layer where you can plug some cognitive system into an overlay environment, or unplug it, as the case may be. At the moment, as you say, it's really quite integrated and not easy to sort of remove.
In a 2009 timeframe, in fact, I think it fit in perfectly for the nature-inspired informatics chapter, I seem to recall. I integrated the brain simulation of Larry Yeager's Polyworld into Noble Ape.
Okay, yes, I think I remember you saying that.
And it was a kind of one-time only integration. I think it acknowledged problems with Polyworld as well, particularly associated with memory leaks. But in Polyworld, memory leaks also show themselves in file creation. So just vast quantities of files being created, and I was able to get it working in terms of kind of compiler integration. It looked like a project that would be of equivalent or greater than Noble Ape as it currently stands, and without any support from Larry Yeager's team at the time, then it just wouldn't have been possible. And certainly the people who Larry nominated to work on Polyworld haven't continued to work on it. One of the fellows, basically, for a short period of time at least, became a reality TV star in the US. In and of itself is quite curious. And yeah, there's just been which is kind of, I mean, I guess I have a kind of paternalistic fear associated with, if I'm hit by a bus, what actually happens to Noble Ape. And I think historically, I mean, Brevet was passed on to Kyle Harrington, from John Clyde to Kyle Harrington. I met Kyle Harrington. We talked at the A-Life conference, actually, for quite a bit over a lunch once, associated with his maintenance of Brevet. Nonetheless, I still don't see any, aside from a Java rewrite, any major progression with Brevet. And I think it's one of the difficult things with these simulations is that they are kind of implicitly fragile, and certainly I guess that's my kind of broader concern with the legacy of Polyworld. At the same time, I'm relatively limited to what I can do. I branched Polyworld on GitHub and have played with it just in terms of getting it to compile, but those kind of integration issues can be really quite time-consuming and overwhelming, and I think that was what Larry was seeing himself, although I don't want to speak for him specifically on this. But anyway, so I have experienced trying to take an existing artificial life simulation and push it into a Noble Ape. It is doable, it's just not particularly maintainable, and I think that's the choice that I make sometimes with Noble Ape, that lots of things are very doable, but actually the general maintenance and the upkeep of them also have some time involved too. And it would have been a solid fork, I mean, without any additional contribution. And I made basically a week's worth of changes in order to get it to work with Noble Ape, and actually fixed a few issues through that.
Mm-hmm. What is the cognitive part of Polyworld actually like?
It's a neural network. It's a relatively basic neural network.
Is it just like a feed-forward type system?
Mm-hmm.
NLP feed-forward?
I don't know. There's not much to be said about it, aside from the fact that obviously it has a series of inputs and outputs that you need to connect. I mean, it exists like that. Funnily enough, the what was it called? Critterding.
Mm-hmm.
used a very similar model, and probably the only problem with crediting is it itself is no longer maintained. The fellow who maintains it has created a new project which he's working on. I think he just got bored, basically, and changed projects. 2-3 years ago, when I used to do biota on a regular basis, I certainly kept abreast of what was going on there, but now I don't even get a sense that the people who were kind of historically maintaining the crediting or their particular forks from crediting have continued with it. Again, I think it takes a degree of maintenance, which, is the boring part, basically. But that was very similar in terms of the potential to actually have interfaces that you just, connected up. But again, in all these cases, it's not a negotiation. It's not something that's agreed upon. It's me taking these interfaces and kind of haphazardly sticking them into Noble Ape, so to speak. It's not like that we're together as, a group of simulators defining an interface and then implementing it accordingly.
Yeah. It can be quite difficult to define open standards. I know that there's been various attempts and failures in the robotics world to do that. But it might be worth having a go. I mean, if you know enough people who are doing similar things, then you might want to have a go at defining a common interface where you can plug in arbitrary cognitive systems into a simulation.
So I'm also nominally on a group of the International Game Developers Association associated with AI standards.
Mm-hmm.
And providing those kind of AI standards. And that was a group that I think probably had about 30 participants, of which 2 participants wanted a defense, as in a defense industry standard.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the rest of us just wanted a standard. That basically dissolved the group almost instantly, because the 2 defense industry guys were just like, well, here's what we have, and we're going with that. And it was like, well, no, it doesn't fit in with anything that anyone else is doing, and it's not actually answering any problems. It's just you guys posturing, basically. That, I think, went on for about a year. And, I mean, similarly, having done these kind of conversations through biota, the difficulty to actually find agreed-upon standards is that these things are ultimately hobbies. I mean, fundamentally. The necessary agreements through standards relate to a certain degree of give and take. And in the case of a hobby, you're just basically, there's no meaningful negotiation that can take place, because ultimately you're getting the enjoyment out of your hobby whether you move to the standard or whether you don't move to the standard or whatever. So it's not a kind of functional end goal purpose. I mean, you can talk to people about motivating these things in terms of, wouldn't it be great? But then to actually invest the time, I mean, I think I was the only simulator who actually implemented the discussed, what we were talking about.
Right.
And everyone else, because, I mean, if you have a finite amount of time, you're going to be working on, what you observe to be the highest priority or your highest interest level. I mean, it is a hobby after all.
Yeah.
Yeah, it takes a lot of motivation, basically, to implement these things. And I'm mindful of the fact that there's plenty to be done with Noble Ape anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if someone is as agreeable as I am for this implementation and willing to put in the effort, then I'm more than happy to work with them. But I think it's a slightly higher bar than just wouldn't it be great if all these things came together. Interestingly enough, I'm not sure if you saw the article that Gaz posted to me that I posted through the developer list. But it was, having read through the blog post a couple of times, and the fact that they get Nick Bostrom's paper completely wrong was a kind of strange irritation to me. In fact, it's interesting because Liz Swan, who's participated in Biota Podcasts and also has edited a couple of Springer books that I've been in, pointed to me a couple of, maybe a year or so ago, maybe 18 months ago, and said, there's this internet meme that's going on that Nick Bostrom is actually really the simulation messiah. And started posting me to links. And it's picked up steam, I think, through Reddit.
Okay.
The quality of, actually, let's read the article or let's read the paper. No, let's just create a Reddit meme. And I think this unfortunately, it kind of discredits, ultimately, having your simulation included in such a large group if the primary paper has not actually been read. But anyway, so I posted to the folk who on the blog, and I'm not sure if they're going to approve my post accordingly. But it does interest me that there are other simulations out there that are doing something like this. But then again, the motivation to actually get us together talking is a very, very different thing. And then also you have to deal with, I mean, as if you go back and listen to the beta recordings associated with this, everyone has their own kind of presuppositions, and as soon as you work with academics in particular, you get a very different set of presuppositions than you start with as a hobbyist, fundamentally.
Yeah, I would expect so, yes.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting problem. I don't think it's one that can be, well, from my set of experiences, easily solved. However, I'm more than willing to work with people that are genuinely interested in doing this.
Yes. Okay. With the Boston reading papers aspect of it, so I was thinking that's kind of it's a bit like an illustration of a mimetic kind of idea, in that those ideas which become most prevalent may be the ones which are good at transmitting themselves quickly. So if you've just sort of skim-read something, or you've just heard a small fragment of information, it's a lot easier to transmit that than to digest a large paper maybe, or a book, and then be able to go from there.
The Feynman quote, I think it's Feynman, where if it was easy to explain, I wouldn't have won a Nobel Prize. I mean, there's a kind of interesting contradiction in that the hard questions that take longer to explain are ultimately, also rich in some regard. Yeah, I think it's a very curious thing. I mean,
if you think of it in terms of the speed of information.
I mean, certainly there have been a number of folks occasionally in the artificial life community, like Dawkins, who've been very successful in finding the shortest possible method to convey the idea. I don't really know if much of my work fits into that, though. Perhaps because of the lack of visuals, perhaps because of the degree of depth. Maybe you can take a couple of sound bites from Noble Ape, but there's actually a lot more under the covers that you need to, But also, more people can, I mean, if you have interests in particular areas, then you'll find things in Noble Ape, and maybe, that'll move on accordingly. But, yeah, it's an interesting problem. I've been thinking about this a bit associated with my recording with Heron Stone, because we've come to some kind of agreement that we're not going to do particular kinds of promotions associated with the recording, which almost is like kosher cooking in some regard, because you then have a kind of forced subset of things that you consider looking at, I guess, before you change religion. And yeah, it's an interesting, the notion of promotion by ideas and short ideas really lends itself to short informational YouTube clips, perhaps spread over multiple YouTube accounts that, a certain group of people will be able to follow certain ideas. I'm sympathetic to that. I think that's very doable. Certainly, the problem I've found so far is doing it all through one YouTube account, and it seems that YouTube's guidance algorithm is so heavily skewed that you need to maintain almost single idea YouTube accounts with feeds associated in order to actually get people to watch your content.
Okay. Well, I'm probably not a very typical YouTube viewer. I tend to watch long videos.
Yes. Yeah, I do as well, but I think we're in the vast minority.
I think so, yes. Very much so.
Another thing that I've liked is the use of subtitles. As soon as you put active subtitles, i.e. subtitles that you've worked on, into content, it seems to have a faster propagation. I think because non-English users have the ability to do the translation accordingly.
Yeah, good thinking, yes.
And I probably need to be very mindful of that, particularly when I do, occasional production things associated with Noble Ape. I mean, what I've done historically is done informal screen recordings with me talking over the top. But I think more and more, as these are the things that are propagating, I probably need to actually consider what I'm saying and organise it accordingly.
Yes.
So in terms of the stuff that you're looking at or have looked at in the past month, I've picked up Baboon Metaphysics. I kind of scanned through it, and it's in my reading pile, probably, I don't know, third or fourth next on the reading list. I also picked up a book on bonobos at a second-hand bookshop. It's called Bonobo Handshake. And I can't recommend this book yet. I just found it, and and disregarded it initially, and then basically took a whole lot of other books to the second-hand bookstore and had credit with the store. So actually I picked that one up, and I saw Steve Grand's Growing Up with Lucy. And I've speed read Steve Grant's Growing Up with Lucy at Bruce Damer's maybe 2 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
I find it one of the... I don't know. I thought for $2 it was a no-brainer to pick up. So I picked that one up too, so it's in the pile with the Bonobo book. And yeah, the Bonobo book probably is in the tens of books to read. I have no priority associated with that, but if I read it and it's good, I'll certainly let you know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I read that Steve Grant book a long time ago when it first came out. So it's about one of his robots.
Certainly.
So, based on the earlier ideas from the Creatures game.
Yes.
And he puts forward a particular idea about computer vision, object recognition, which I don't think went any further than in the book. So
yes.
It was interesting. I tried implementing it at the time.
And didn't have any success, or had some success, or what was your...
like a lot of computer vision algorithms, limited success in some limited circumstances. Getting things which are genuine is a more difficult problem. As I remember it, I think it was based on some sort of spiral type idea, in which you would maybe sample pixels in a spiral and maybe dump that into a histogram or something like that.
That's a very interesting approach, actually. Anyway, I will read it accordingly. I can't recall. I mean, again, it was 2 years ago. I seem to find his Creatures book. I don't know. I guess the problem with these books is that when you have primary access to the people and you've had the ability to talk to them and ask questions, a book is really a suboptimal format to get the information.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, often you can get much more in-depth ideas from a book than you can from a discussion.
Yes, I guess the nature of my discussion with Steve Brand is very much associated with the fact that I have not necessarily his book work, but in terms of papers that were published and also, various third-party source code dumps and other things that exist of his work. I mean, I have a relatively good understanding associated with the Creatures period. I'm not sure if you're aware of this story. I say it occasionally publicly, but there was a magazine in Australia that wrote an article, basically, and I was already aware of Steve's work, but they went through it with great detail and identified the associations between Creatures and Noble Ape. And it was actually quite critical because basically they said, or they asserted, that I had done the work and Steve had done the sketching. I don't think there's any meaningful connection. I think basically if you do something that's relatively similar, it's relatively similar. But it was quite curious at the time. So they actually offered to pay for me to go to Biota 2 to actually go and meet with Steve. And I'm not sure if they'd been in contact with him as well. I was certainly told quite clearly that there were no more tickets available. I mean, but my view is that they probably hadn't polluted any communication with Steve and co. It was just a curious period of time. But it's quite interesting because in my early interactions with Steve, which I still have email correspondence and things like that, I mean, I was in no way accusatory. In fact, I wasn't really. The narrative that the magazine took was completely separate to my own ideas at the time. But yeah, it was a kind of curious interaction to kind of compare and contrast. Because in Australia, there's always been a kind of historical legacy associated with the rip-off. Like, Australians do a wide variety of different kinds of development, and mysteriously these things are also, done in other countries, and sometimes with reference, sometimes without reference. And it's something that's affected. I mean, my mother wrote a children's book in, I guess, the early 90s, which almost, basically exactly the same idea, down to some quite curious subtleties, were put in an American book that was published 3 or 4 years afterwards. And there was some ongoing discussion with her publisher at the time associated with whether or not they would litigate. And ultimately the publisher decided not to litigate. But there's a kind of underlying narrative in Australia associated with the fact that, I guess, on one part there's a sense of guilt because a lot of people actually leave Australia once they, receive an education, particularly if they're interested in actually doing anything outside the island, so to speak. But at the same point, there's the idea that there are things that motivate these people leaving, and one of them is that their work is not, correctly attributed or identified. And I think at the time it was kind of a curious additional story that was going on in parallel to all these other things. But they were perfectly willing to pay for me to go to Biota and actually attend the conference, and actually they wanted me to deliver papers, which I'd already proposed. The Maxis fellow, whose name escapes me, his face is in my head, who did SimCity and Will Wright, he had a similar experience with Biota too. So who knows whether there was just some broader concern that anyone associated with particular kinds of software simulations that may or may not be games probably should attend or not, or, whether it was just complete confusion. I mean, certainly the only information I can get from people who were in any way connected with this thing was that it was just complete confusion. But it is an interesting kind of side narrative. And also I do wonder what's happened to Steve Grant. I mean, I do communicate with him very periodically, but I don't have any... I didn't put any... Because I didn't have any money at the time, I didn't put any money into his Kickstarter, but he still gave me access. But at the same point, I'm really not sure what happened with the Kickstarter either.
Yeah, I'm not either. I don't know. I haven't checked back on it. The book I was reading anyway, the Metaphysics book.
Yes.
There are a couple of things that I was reading in there which changed my ideas a little bit, and which might be useful to include in Noble Ape possibly. The first one is the idea of redirected frustration or redirected stress. So if one ape gets harassed by another, there may be a tendency to immediately go and harass another individual of a lower rank.
Yes.
To sort of redirect the anger, if you like.
We have a cat that does that. We have a cat that, if you stroke him in a particular fashion, his tail begins to twitch, and he gets annoyed, and then he'll find a lower cat and go and pounce on it and chase it around and do a wide variety of things after that, which is actually quite striking, because you know it's going to happen, and you know by your interaction it's going to cause a third cat to be chased around or what have you. And it's interesting when it occurs, because by the time it's occurred, it's already gone too far. So you then are begging the question of, but it happens almost completely reproducibly.
Right, yeah. So that's something which doesn't happen in Noble Ape currently.
No.
Or at least not to my knowledge. And might be worth including in some way. Well, how it would be implemented is another question.
Well, because you have these kind of disputes that come up to physical blows, it would be interesting actually to test if it's not implicitly already going on.
It might be. You never really know. And because of the way that the language is implemented and so on, a wide variety of behaviours could potentially be possible.
We do have the ability now with events to actually track fights and potentially put honour in what is actually put out. We almost need more debugging associated with that to say, Ape A fought with Ape B and lost, and honour value reduction, interaction with Ape C, fight. Because this also produces speedy ejection as well. I mean, there are a variety of other factors that come through this that are probably quite important.
Right.
But it returns to the notion that should the ape know its honour? Should it have primary access to that? Or maybe you could have a secondary honour value that was perceived honour.
Yes. That's the way I originally thought of it. The sort of monolithic honour that exists currently is just for convenience.
Yeah.
But a more accurate model would be that each ape keeps track of sort of who it thinks is higher rank and who it thinks is lower rank. And there could even be disagreements where you could have non-monolithic ranking structures.
Certainly.
Although in practice, I think particularly for male baboons, the structure is very hierarchical. There aren't really these dual hierarchies or more than dual. The other idea that I was thinking of from the book was that levels of stress for particular individuals isn't necessarily just a simple function of rank within the group. It's more related to changes of rank within the group and uncertainty about where you are in the social structure. So that makes it a little bit more complicated than how I was thinking of it previously.
So I floated the idea of, through a discussion associated with the Origin of Mind chapter with Heron, I floated the idea of the number of internal representations that were needed, which is something that we discussed last recording. So is it a case there where 6 is too few? Maybe we should have, say, 20, but with an optimizing function that also went through. Here's another point I wanted to make. I've been also looking passively at the Noble Ape over network issue. Mm-hmm. And I found 3 quantities that need to be... So you almost need a constance, a phenotype, and an underlying change with that. You need a set of constants, which ultimately can be transmitted at one point. You need a set of values that are unlikely to change or will not change within a cycle. And then you need a set of values that are going to change within a cycle. And these 3 groups basically define the network interface associated with communication of this information. Because you can have circumstances where if you have 2 apes, one of which is on the processor A, all the information is on the processor, and one of which all the information is not on the processor, maybe you have the constants and the phenotype that is circulated, then you have to have a way where the mathematics is like one directional. It's only like associated with basically either reading or writing. And multiple writes, you can't have circumstances of multiple writes, so there's almost an ownership. The only place where this breaks down through reading the code is the brain code, because on the brain code you have dual execution on both sides. But I think something else that I was considering through that, and the brain code ultimately is about the internal representations as well. So we need to think about how we potentially change the brain code to be just one-directional operations, but also with the potential that there's this optimization as well, where the optimization becomes almost like an internal phenotype or something like that. There's some mapping where that needs to occur. So maybe the internal phenotype is what is transmitted and can be acted on. But yeah, there's something that breaks the kind of let's run Noble Ape over networks with minimum traffic, and that's something that I wanted to put to you. I mean, do you understand the concept that I'm describing?
I think what you're trying to get at is that you're trying to maintain deterministic performance in a fundamentally parallel system over a network.
Yes.
Is that? Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's pretty problem. So you would need clean sort of inputs and outputs, which can be shared. And it is pretty difficult because potentially you've got lots of individuals who could be interacting in the same cycle.
Exactly. But I think we can develop interfaces to do that. And the interesting thing associated with this notion of having like stereotypes or archetypes, internal archetypes that are optimized accordingly, is that this is actually the ideal circumstance to fix this problem as well. Because if we can create something with kind of internal archetype optimization as well as brain code, then we can ultimately snip you have to have both bits of brain code on the same processor to do the, Yeah,
that's a reasonable idea. You can think of the archetypes or stereotypes as a kind of compression. And since you want to maintain maximum performance over a network, it would make sense to maybe exchange archetypes or high-level concepts rather than specific details, if possible.
Only for the brain code action. In fact, what happens is that's an external action as well. That's an external internal. You've got your Actually, it's 2 external. You've got the meter and the met, so to speak. But it needs to be written in such a way that only one of them is doing the processing work on the data at the specific time, which can be done.
Mm.
It can be done in a parallel fashion. You just need to be very mindful of the data that's being exchanged.
Right.
It's an interesting problem anyway. I just wanted to put it out to you, Bob, because it is something that we're probably going to have to tackle in the next couple of months associated with potentially handling both this optimization but also addressing this issue specifically.
Yeah, yeah. Mm.
I think it's a kind of fun problem as well, because it's one that ultimately gives us a chance to be really smart associated with the solutions that we pick. I mean, it gives us a chance to potentially find, cut across solutions that will just work will basically make the simulation run faster and, have this optimized kind of communication over the network.
Yeah.
And I think also it will produce, in one sense you could view it purely as a constriction, but in another sense I think actually the solution that comes through this could be quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, the system as it stands is just limited to a single machine at the moment, so if you really did want to scale it up a bit, those kind of problems would have to be confronted at some point.
I think they're actually really primary associated with moving. I mean, you could have an ultra chatty, let's communicate absolutely everything, let's do lockstep cycle kind of stuff, but I mean, ultimately that would just, everything would crunch. I mean, you would lose any benefit of running it over a network with those kind of problems. So what needs to occur is that potentially there is another solution, but the one that I've proposed is one that I've been thinking about associated with minimizing the amount of network traffic, because that's the critical part. The network traffic is the slowest thing.
It is, yes.
But it's an interesting problem space, because once it's cracked, I have, as a married man, I have fewer computers than you have. It was part of the marriage requirements that I just get rid of all these dusty old things. I still have a couple that I've kind of snuck into the cupboard somewhere, but my view is I probably need to get rid of them too. But nonetheless, it's an interesting problem, because once you solve it in a kind of local area network situation, you have the potential to actually put it out and utilize the internet.
Oh, indeed, yes. Yes.
And I think that would actually create a kind of community simulation perspective. I mean, as it is currently, Noble Ape is a kind of lone wolf pursuit associated with... but to have a community network associated with that, and actually to have the network part of it be a critical maintained part, I think could be very interesting.
Yes, yeah. And there probably would be some overlap with the idea of trying to compartmentalize or modularize the cognitive system.
Exactly. The other benefit that you get, which is quite subtle, is that you have all these things that are now, you have the kind of rich evolution of server that has occurred in the past 10 years, maybe even the past 5 years. You have, the potential once you've written this transport and what have you, you can then write exclusive dedicated servers that don't have client-side interfaces that can do a lot of the processing, and ultimately you may even end up with something that just draws the Noble Ape simulation with the view that all of it exists on external servers.
Possibly.
I think there's a whole lot of interesting... That was part of the early investigation associated with using the Second Life client, for example. That if you could have a distinct client-server relationship with the simulation, and the client was maintained by a third party, then you would get basically all the same enjoyment that you get out of the simulation. But it would be, you'd probably get more, because you would be working with something that was, optimizing in its own particular direction. It's not something that
I never really did anything very much with Second Life, but I know from reading some of the AGI stuff from Ben Goertzel about Second Life, it's quite a difficult system to deal with. It's quite difficult to implement any sort of even semi-genuine AI within Second Life, just because of its severe limitations.
There are a number of problems with it. The first is the rendering of space, and I had some communication and looked at the OpenSim code, But OpenSim is just completely the wrong platform to do this. If nothing more, it's written in mono. But yeah, so until Second Life produces a server interface, and even really a basic server, open source, then it's not going to happen. And I mean, what Second Life is concentrating now on is, server narrative and all this stuff, which is very proprietary. So yeah, they've moved in a different direction as well. But my proposal was never to add Noble Ape to the Second Life server. It was to take the server interface and create a Noble Ape Second Life server that had the Noble Ape simulation and the server, whatever it needed to communicate with the client. You could potentially, with a kind of, 2-year project, reverse engineer the client. And they do nominally, I think, for a period of time at least, release the client open source. But it was just one of those, this is going to be a very substantial project, and the benefits are relatively speculative. But no, it's an interesting just initial investigation. And I think Peter Newman looked at doing it independently as well, because potentially I think Bruce Damer was looking for using the Second Life client for his NASA stuff, and Peter wanted a early stages simulation that he could integrate just to test it out. And he looked at Noble Ape, and I helped him out a bit with that. But yeah, nothing came of that as well. But yeah, it's an interesting, once you've looked at these kind of problems associated with network information sharing and actually applied it to Noble Ape, I think you get a completely different set of problems that come from that. But it certainly then aligns with, a lot of stuff that's going on currently independently. And funnily enough, you'd think perhaps the games industry would be potentially leading some of this, but obviously what happened with SimCity 4 or whatever is just more kind of conservatizing on their part associated with, cloud simulation. But yeah, it's an interesting problem set, and it's certainly one that I think, because, you obviously implemented the brain code, could be well placed to consider. And we don't need to implement the network code yet. We just need to basically create some kind of constriction associated with the flow of information to indicate that although all the beings currently are on the same processor, that might not be the case in the future, and their communication interface should change.
Yeah.
I think actually it's an interesting thing, because the network issues may actually be artificial. We may actually be completely overthinking the problem, and we probably should start by just creating a network interface that communicates absolutely everything that's necessary and start testing it out. Because modern-day networks, modern-day Wi-Fi networks are actually pretty good for data, so it might actually be worth doing the reverse and actually just start by creating a network interface and then force everything down from that. So, I'm sympathetic to that as well.
Yeah.
Because I think certainly in terms of just general network traffic over even Wi-Fi or Ethernet, it would be a good indication to see, well, actually, is this bottleneck real, or is this bottleneck just something that could be perceived? If you look at the Noble Ape file size, even in terms of output, yeah, it would be a little bit boring to basically move that stuff backwards and forwards every simulation cycle. So, yeah. The brain itself, the actual cognitive simulation, the 32 by 32 by 32, could remain local to the processor. In fact, a wide variety of things could remain local to the processor. The only big question mark currently is over the brain code. So more to be defined in this area. In terms of the next month, do you kind of get a sense of the things that interest you that you may be working on with Noble Ape?
Well, I'll probably continue on the skeleton and vascular system visualization. Probably mostly I'll be doing that, I would imagine.
So I might start this network thing. I might start a network interface and just run it here locally on... I've got a Mac Mini that I can get that running on. And just see how that actually works and where the bottlenecks are. And obviously I can do timing and various other things. But I think the main thing is just continuing to unify the Mac, Windows and Linux versions, and probably add full functionality to the Linux version. I wanted to, the Windows version, but the Linux version too. I want to introduce multi-windows to the Linux version, just 3 windows. I kind of like the cleanness of a single window, but I think you do miss something. I've also implemented the command line through, so you can do a command line run on the Linux version now as well.
Yes.
Command line GUI at the same time.
I tested that out. It works okay.
Yeah. It's kind of a fun interface, actually. I'd play with it and add stuff as you see fit, because, I mean, the things that I've added associated with being able to, do basically multi-threaded commands and a series of other things have all come through general use. There may also be subtle bugs, which is the secondary point, that, the more you use it, the more you find these things. I found on 2 processor machines there are a series of bugs that I think I've squashed. And that's an interesting condition. Yeah, but aside from that, there are probably a couple of threading things that I might look at this month. But really, my focus is getting the platform unification down, and probably also, as I've said, starting to unify the graph and draw stuff. But the network problem is a kind of niggling thing, and it's certainly something that I've spent a couple of evenings on over the past month. So I might just implement the very, very basic kind of network communication with the view that two identical simulations are run on separate machines and just communicate over a network and see the kind of traffic that's needed for that.
Right, okay.
It may potentially change the way all the being interactions are handled as well. There may be some kind of new agreed-upon interface associated with constant... Actually, phenotype is the wrong term. It's like constant will be constant with it. Will be constant for all time, will be constant within one cycle, and that is likely to change within the cycle. They're the 3 states. And I'll start doing some experiments associated with that, and feel free to dive into that as well. But really, I'm very interested in seeing what comes out of this, particularly the addition of genetics as well. When is the plan to have a kind of one-size-fits-all skeleton, put in the organs, digestive system, blood flow, this kind of thing, and then start playing with the genetics?
Well, the plan is to integrate the genetics first, I would think, just so that I can get some idea of what the skeleton will look like with different parameters. What I'll do is take bits out of the genetics and then use those to act as scaling factors on the various bones. So I think that's the next thing to do, probably. And then after that, I'll go on to the vascular diagram section.
There's a beauty in the GUI associated with cycling between apes, but also creating new simulation spaces. And both of those will give you, in relatively short form, as you cycle between apes or as you create new simulation spaces, a good visual selection of possibilities associated with the skeleton. So once you've got an algorithm put in through the GUI, it's very fast to switch between, 5, 6, potentially 10, 15, 20 different apes within a very short period of time. So you can see visually, sometimes you can see, 10 of these things within a second, which gives you a very strong visual cue of the kind of floating, almost the fuzzy space associated with the ranges that you put in. But it's a good way of visually checking it, and it's certainly something that I use quite a bit. Although there aren't a lot of really strong visual indicators, obviously, with the noble apes, but there certainly are associated with the brain code and other things. So putting the brain code on the screen and then switching between multiple apes gives me a very fast indication of what's going on that front.
I think from the point of view of the vascular visualization, that should be no different. You should still be able to use the same keys, and you should still be able to see changes, different morphologies and so on.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to this aspect, Bob, because it gives a kind of, simulation principles rooted, yet visually very striking, means basically for showing an aspect of the simulation. And certainly I took a screenshot of it and put it up on my Facebook page, and there was a kind of furious liking from a wide variety of parties who've obviously been waiting for these kind of steps to occur in some meaningful sense with Noble Ape for quite some time. And similarly, I have a kind of long-term project associated with getting serious kind of computer artist folk involved with the simulation and these kind of early stage things. Well, even having the likes of Mike in LA involved in the simulation lends itself to that. I mean, giving occasional advice. But I think in the long term, there are a number of interesting industries that already have intelligent agent models that remain proprietary that they pay a small fortune for. The Noble Ape seems to have all the same advantages of what they're paying a small fortune for. And it would be interesting to see if Noble Ape could slot into those environments and then potentially us get some of the benefit of, obviously, the aesthetic components of that. But it does need a little carrot. And I think the carrot here is exactly what you're doing.
There possibly could be spin-offs, I imagine. And then if you're trying to simulate a physiology, and you want a visualization of that, maybe it could be a separate kind of program to do that, possibly. Don't know if there are any sort of open source systems which actually do that at the moment. Visualize a body, visualize the metabolism, things like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy for Noble Ape to be a front runner in this line. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting project. I probably also should note in a public recording form, because I feel on a number of levels very indebted to the work that you've done with Noble Ape. But in the past week, I've been able to make a small effort and contribution back to this effort, and I purchased a laptop which has arrived with you.
Yes.
I state this in writing. I do state it publicly, but I even occasionally state it to you through these recordings, but I am really, really appreciative of all your efforts with Noble Ape. And it has an immense impact on me in terms of my thinking and development as well. But it's great to know that there's another human somewhere off in the far, far away that also, and I think, this has been the nature of the simulation as well, that there have been people who have identified themselves. But in your case, associated with the quality of work, but also the length of time, I think the laptop was the least that I could do here.
Well, indeed, thanks very much for that. That's a tremendous thing to have, I suppose. My previous laptop wasn't really necessarily anything wrong with it. It's 6 years old, but still runs the latest Linuxes pretty well. But it's always good to have new hardware and be able to push it to the limits in terms of processing and so on, especially for things like computer vision and more advanced type of algorithms.
So you have noticed an appreciable benefit in the new laptop?
Oh, definitely. If you compile the GTK version of the GUI for Noble Ape, it runs way faster than on my other laptop.
Ah! I cut the GTK version recently. I'll reinstate it.
Okay.
Ah, I'll go back and reinstate it. Good to know. No, I cut it because I didn't think anyone was using it, but now if you're using it, then I'll put it back. No, I'll put it back, definitely. Okay, Bob.
Well, I mean, going forward, is there really going to be support for GTK unless I support it?
That's probably the point.
I've been focusing most of the effort on Qt at the moment.
Would you prefer GTK? I mean, I'll put it back, because, I mean, my view is it's your choice.
Well, I think my opinion is that probably Qt is a better windowing system to go with. More easily cross-platform, has a nice sort of IDE that beginners could get used to quite easily. There are similar things for GTK, there's Glade and so on. Perhaps not quite as nice as Qt Creator.
Do you feel that GTK gives an improved performance over Qt?
Not necessarily, no. No, I don't think there's any significant performance difference.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of, anyway.
I removed GTK based on the fact that I thought we were devoting more time to Qt, and Qt has the benefit that I can work on it natively as well.
Right.
But I do feel... I always hate removing things like this, because, I do feel that maybe the GTK... We never would have considered Qt 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But now we can, because they've made changes. My only concern is, well, look, I'm confident that we'll continue with Qt. I'll look at implementing multi-windows with Qt, because the problems with GTK were just kind of ongoing, and I don't think I could maintain 2 versions of Linux. I can maintain the Qt implementation currently, so let's keep it that way with the removal of with the removal of GTK. You probably need to update your version to see these things disappear. Maybe zip what you have currently and then compress what you have currently, update your version.
one thing about the Qt GUI as it's currently implemented, the update for each cycle is based on a timer. So even though this has got like double the processing power on the new laptop, there will be no visual difference in terms of the speed that it's running. So at least that will be consistent across different hardware.
It was an implementation that Apple did with the Mac OS X. Prior to that, you could do it as it was updating, basically, as fast as possible. But Apple made a very conscious decision to basically maintain update by frame rate. And what I did with Noble Ape, which is probably why we should still use a timer, or ideally if the timer can be synced to the screen refresh, that's the best possible solution, which may require some investigation in Qt. But that's the best possible solution, with the view that you can't get any more information out than the screen refresh in terms of the process scale, unless you... there used to be, I can't remember what it was called now, but there used to be this method where the simulation continued and then it synced on the screen refresh. So basically it drew what it had at the screen refresh point and then the simulation continued, then it drew what it had at the screen refresh point. So they weren't tightly coupled. And that was an interesting interface, which I may actually bring back. The only problem is it kind of really hits the processor very hard. And, on laptops in particular, fans start going off and, the whole thing becomes, a bit like a cooker. And the logic associated with optimization, I think, is interesting if you no longer, or if you're hinged on the screen refresh, is you can actually pack more stuff in as well. So yes, that is a difference, but I think on all platforms, Windows does it implicitly. They do it implicitly on refresh. So basically, they catch it as well. So I would prefer Mac, Windows, Linux to all have the same kind of on refresh stuff. And if you can get the frame rate, if you can get the hertz on the monitor and then update the timer according to that on Qt, that would probably be, or just alternatively, if you can catch on refresh. Re-execute on Qt, that would probably be the way to do it.
Okay.
I can dig into that too, Bob, because I'm a Qt developer as well.
Yes, okay. Just something related to that as well. From the point of view of visualizing the vasculature, although it's not implemented yet, I'm imagining that as you're looking at blood vessels and the changes in diameters of blood vessels, the speed of it might be such that it just looks as if the vessels are just vibrating, almost like vibrating strings. And so that might be an issue. It might be a problem from the point of view of visualizing.
Well, this is an interesting thing. So what you then need to have, and I've thought about this associated with time. I mean, the speech is the same thing, the audio part of the speech, is that the simulation runs relatively quickly associated with communication.
Mm-hmm.
You'd almost like have chirps, basically, or some means to indicate that communication was going on, and then perhaps you could slow it down to real time. That was part of Mike's commentary associated with the vascular simulation in particular, was that you need to find simulation methods where maybe the diameter is wrong, maybe actually a colour would be better served in the time. So rather than having a spatial move, a colour transition is oftentimes easier to see, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Or maybe a spatial move in reverse. These are two things that obviously you can get through experimentation better than anything.
Yeah. Also, I was thinking of maybe visualizing the heartbeat, literally drawing the heart and having it beat at a sort of appropriate rate. And obviously that rate wouldn't be the rate at which the simulation was running. It would just be real time.
So that's interesting. You could have some strange kind of observation time. So basically the simulation was running at its own pace, but what you were doing was almost taking
a sort of snapshot from a point in time, maybe.
Each simulation cycle is a minute of time.
Mm-hmm.
Within that, what you would do is show... Yeah, you'd have a simulation time component, but the visualization of the ape would have to be at a different time component, and somehow you would show it beating normally, but obviously as the ape got more stressed in the simulation, perhaps the beating would increase but they would be in time distinct. Yeah, now that produces a very interesting problem for the...
Tricky to deal with.
Yeah. That you'd need to actually have another... No, the purpose of the timer is that you just need to have another representation of the drawing of the ape time, but at the same point to have it keyed into what was going on within the simulation. I think what you would do is probably find a recognized fraction, which is ultimately the 8 brain cycles per second. So within that, you do have a trigger, which is the 8 brain cycles per second. The 8 brain cycles per second gives you every 10 seconds. No, it actually gives you in real time what the time is, and then the decision is made every 10 seconds. So you have two values. You have what's going on internally in the simulation, and then you do have an external world time that comes in through the draw interface that you can utilize here. And what you would do is actually have a representation that says per every however many fractions of a second of draw cycle, this needs to occur based on a particular value. And obviously this value may increase and decrease as the ape goes through, whatever in the simulation.
Would doing that, though, sort of freeze the simulation in the background and just...
Not at all. What you do is you have values which affect things within the time movement, but which the time movement can interchange based on. So, for example, the problem is that the simulation that you've written, you need a different simulation, unfortunately, for actually drawing the organs and these kind of things. I would implement first the simulation that you have.
Yeah, and just see what it looks like.
But then you need a disconnect where you look at... it's almost like you see various mathematical transforms. Fourier theory is a good example. Where in Fourier theory you will see, in the time domain you'll see sinusoidal oscillations. In the frequency domain you'll see a spike. This is analogous, that what you're seeing in the time domain is a series of oscillations, and what you need to have is a value to describe those oscillations as a spike. And then the spike that goes into the underlying simulation can then also be passed into the graphical representation. And then from that, it can translate into the things in the graphical simulation as well. You need a time-independent means of communicating the critical information, basically. And then re-encoding the time, be it within the simulation itself or within the graphics.
So that exists to a limited extent already, in that you have things like heart rate and...
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So you take the things that are like that currently and you implement based on that, and then you take the ones that aren't like that currently, which actually are. The thing is that they actually are. It's just one is taken in a simulation time and one needs to be taken in a real-world time. And that's an interesting problem, but I think it's relatively solvable. And you'll actually get quite an interesting set of experiments through that with the visualization.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll have to see how that turns out.
What you can do initially, as I've described associated with the network problem as well, is just implement it implement what you see in the graph in the same time domain as the simulation. And then basically, and if you need me to look at it as well, I can come through and start, doing proposed changes and optimizations based on, as I say, like having this frequency-like communication between the two, and then making things time independent. Because I think mathematically that's relatively interesting, but that's the kind of thing that I can do, late at night, basically. I don't need my full cognitive ability in order to implement those kind of changes. So let me know when you're ready, and I'll kind of dive in boots and all and try that one out.
Okay. On the theme of time, I noticed when I was looking at the code, it looked like you'd implemented something along the line, or were going to implement something along the lines of subjective time. That is the ape's impression of time passing, rather than the actual time.
Yes.
The simulation time. That is.
Yes. That's the missing quantity. Because ultimately, if they have to describe things, there needs to be place and time are two things that are relatively described. And the place, if you have a place component and you have a time component, so the place component was originally described associated with you creating a grid and there being like regions. But the thing that struck me by the regions is that they were perfectly sized where you could have a naming convention for each of the regions. I mean, some of them are just water. But some of them are very definitely coastline, some of them are very definitely islands, some of them are very definitely mountains, some of them are very definitely flatland.
Yes.
Because the cut is sufficiently small, you could actually let the apes kind of find names for the locations, and then they could be, you'd have some agreed upon names that would come through community agreement, and then from that, hopefully, maybe, those agreements would actually create an underlying language to describe flatland, mountains, grassland, coast, islands, these kind of things.
Yes, perhaps, yes.
That's a hypothesis. But the same thing happens with time. Because you linguistically, I mean, this is a very simple version, but what happens, English is a good example of this. You have a whole lot of tribes, they get slapped around a bit, and they eventually have to unify their language. And they have to come to it through agreements, which are ultimately negotiations, and obviously there are power dynamics and a wide variety of other things. But basically they come to an agreement. My view is that when noble apes interact, they have their own internal language, they have maybe some familial taught language. But when they interact with other apes, if they want to spend quality time, meaningful communication time, then they need to actually modify their language as part of that process. And time is a component of that. But I think time and place are the two easiest ones. Because once you have time and place, then you have a means of giving relative description. So when I met with Chris Adami, one of the things that he pointed out was that we needed to have ways of actually verifying information interchange claims.
Okay.
And part of that's fundamentally to do with space and time. Because you need to be able to say that ape and that ape have had an agreement to meet at a particular place and a particular time. But their views of place and time may be different. That's a curious thing. I don't know if it happens to you. It happens to me periodically, where I will organise to meet someone and turn up at the place, and they will not be there. And they, through their own implicit assumptions, it's happened to me very recently with work, they're in a completely different place that they think is this, and, and it writes itself. It's comedic. It happens frequently. But the same kind of problems need to exist. You need to write a relative view of these things in order for them to be embodied, with the view that some of these things can be optimized out. And I'm very mindful that you don't want to explicitly write everything. What you want is something where these things will be implicitly decided. But there is a gap between... And it's interesting because relative time, I mean, you very rarely talk about things in milliseconds, but you'll talk about things in minutes, hours, but also time of day. I'll go meet you for lunch. Well, there's an implicit assumption of time and then maybe some clarification. There are these kind of things that occur, and you don't want to create a artificial time based on the simulation. And the same thing interests me actually with regards to weather, because I think the weather simulation, particularly now I've been working on it relatively passionately, I'm interested in moving from this kind of contour 3-level defined weather to actually a considerably more granular weather, where there is notions of kind of cloud cover and rain and...
Okay, so there's more physicality to it.
Exactly, and thunderstorms and just... And we talked a little bit, and since we last talked, I have spent a week in Las Vegas, and I did spend some of that time working on Noble Ape, but I didn't spend any of the time associated with the deformable land. But I think the deformable land is also part of that.
Yeah. In the more distant past, I think you did even mention things like currents, ocean currents.
Yes. Yeah, no, the weather simulation actually is also a large body of water simulation too. I mean, it's interesting that exactly that's the case, and particularly with wind and these kind of things, you can create a variety of different effects. The relative time code was kind of started, and then, as often happens with Noble Ape, something more pressing kind of came. But yeah, it's certainly there in place to be edited accordingly. I think also I'd like to see some kind of rework of the brain code, which perhaps will come through this notion of archetypes, and perhaps through something else. I guess there's ape script in the brain code, and my ultimate view would be to unify that into something that has the potential for human readability. So you can actually get kind of debug output that actually makes kind of causal sense in some regard, even if it contains all these relativisms and curious names and things.
Years ago, there was an idea floating around in the AGI community to maybe use a language called Lodgeban. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No, I haven't, but yeah.
It's an invented language, and the idea behind it was that it's relatively unambiguous, so that you could have sort of programs which understand other programs. So it would be easier to implement as an AI language rather than, say, English or other languages which are highly ambiguous. I don't know if that's that kind of idea has any usefulness.
The problem is that the ambiguity in English, or the ambiguity in any language, is actually a fascinating part of it. The lack of exactness.
And you could say it's the strength in terms of narrative.
Yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting process, actually. Yeah, this again, I think, is in the kind of 3 to 6 month problem bin, but probably something that we'll need to come back to. The ability to have, I mean, I like the social events in that regard, and I think, if anything, we could make the social events richer.
Oh, definitely, yes. Yeah. So things like playing with children and stuff like that.
Exactly. And you're right. I knew there was a reason that I put in the relative space, relative time. It was exactly that. It was the fact that the event code would then become distinctly richer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes.
Also, it gives the ability to add projections in the future.
Right.
Which I think are they're important for understanding, because they're things that can be ticked off or part of, I think the thing that is lacking currently explicitly in the events is, it's a bit like what you originally described associated with Ape A gets angry with Ape B gets angry with Ape C.
Yeah.
You could almost have a description of that through the events as well, like almost a predictive. It's not really technically what the event is, but it's some discussion associated with the motivation that occurs from that event.
Yes.
Almost like a contract, I guess, of potential future outcomes.
No. I did include something which is similar to potential future outcomes, in that apes can have sort of intentions, if you like. So they might intend to chew grass or something like that. And maybe the next time they come across some grass, that will be within the event log. And there's a bit of code that looks at that and sort of biases the behaviour in that direction. It's a kind of crude way of doing it, I admit. But it is a sort of very limited future orientation.
Well, it's interesting, actually, because it covers a wide variety of interactions, not just eating grass, but, oh yes, I have a detail that I've got to pass on to so-and-so when I next talk with them. And, of course, these things can be forgotten, these things can be optimised by priority, things can be lost, what have you. But yeah, intention, I think, is a very interesting property, which I think kind of exists implicitly in the simulation currently. I mean, implicitly, these kind of elements are percolating, but it's interesting if we could distill it through the implicit interactions.
Right. Well, I think the way that I implemented the intentions was you've got individual events in your list, and those events can be either something which you did in the past, or they can be an intention to do that something in the future. So it's just like a single bit almost, either past or future.
Exactly. So yeah, you take the existing event code and you change it associated with its representation of time. Interesting. So there's a phenomenon which is frequently described to me, which historically the cognitive simulation could do in some regard, associated with repeated optimization as well. So there's this whole notion that particularly like if a noble ape likes eating grass and has a reinforced experience associated with eating grass in a particular place, that the ape comes to a realization which probably needs to be described in some fuller form, but that they will return to that, the kind of, not OCD, yes, OCD. The OCD element that you could write in that, once the ape has had a series of good experiences at a place at a time, they come back to those places. And that also creates kind of community meeting points as well, The difficulty, and I've tracked this recently, actually, I've tracked it by putting apes in the same space and then letting them move, particularly to see what kind of language discourse goes on, if by kind of forcing apes into particular areas, like will it force them to talk and these kind of things more.
Mm-hmm.
Andy raised on the last recording the idea of barriers, and I probably should implement that explicitly as well, because I think that's an interesting land deformation issue too. But if you create cliffs at a particular point, it almost forces, meeting around those points as you kind of avoid, committing suicide or what have you. So yeah, I think there's some interesting possibilities associated with land deformation.
You could maybe even have more drama. You could have apes which push other apes off cliffs.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. With the potential occasionally that the pushed apes would survive.
Yes. If they fall into water.
Yes. Or just avoiding a rock by pure luck, these
maybe,
kind of things.
Or fall in a tree or a shrub.
Exactly. So, yeah, no, that would be a very interesting... Yeah, land deformation is relatively cheap. I should really do that. I would do it probably with similar kind of fractal pieces. But it's interesting because it's rounder. It's kind of fractal, round, fractal, round, fractal, round. And I'd need to create some additional fractal interest to create those kind of environmental bits. And obviously some of them would occur in the ocean and some of them would occur on the beach and some of them would occur on the land, which I guess just creates rocky outcrops and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you'd need to have a deformed contour that said, at this point, there is a distinct drop. It's interesting now because the land is now at a far higher resolution, kind of explicitly associated with drawing it. And I think increasingly that defined resolution, the higher resolution, will be what's acted on. In fact, I could use the existing fractal mapping code just to produce really high resolution fractal maps within that rather than the current rounding for it, which actually would produce far more interesting landscapes too. The difficulty is that because the landscapes currently are so heavily tied into the draw terrain, that I have to be very mindful that, one of the moves to explicitly OpenGL was that I could probably add considerably more interesting terrain because I wouldn't have to then write the equivalent per pixel draw command, basically.
Okay.
Because the drawing of the terrain is very heavily hinged to the terrain. So, but the cliffs I could almost have like a grey rocky colour that I would use to represent the cliffs potentially, or something like that. There are ways I could do that quite comfortably. You could have you'd have interesting rock effects as well. I'd be very interested in, you could have sediment and things like that, potentially finding fossils, all this kind of beautiful stuff that you could throw on the rock.
And if you have two cliffs adjacent, then it's like a crevasse. You could have something like apes falling down a crevasse.
Or, more importantly, apes throwing rocks down into the crevasse on top of other apes or other things. I mean, a wide variety of additional kind of so-and-so throws a stone at so-and-so. You'd have to, have additional velocity vectors, land comparison, this kind of stuff. But it'd be beautiful.
There's a theory about early humans, I think Neanderthals maybe, that one of their hunting strategies was to deliberately sort of harry large mammals over cliffs.
Yep.
Which is a relatively easy way of killing them, as opposed to using sharp sticks.
Certainly.
It's quite difficult.
Particularly because they're running in, if you can focus them in a particular direction, then yes.
Yeah.
They're easier to hit if they're falling down, I guess. Fundamentally. Yeah. Okay, I've added land deformation into my to-do list. It just takes, as with the weather, it takes because I do this in kind of, 2 hours in an evening, it takes a very particular mind to do this kind of work at particular times based on a variety of other factors. So I do tend to optimize the stuff that I do on Noble Ape associated with my current state, frame of mind, what have you. And some of these projects, the land in particular, is probably best suited for long form, but I can if-def. And if-def's very useful in these circumstances, so you can kind of partially develop, and that's what I did with the weather fundamentally. I did it over 3 days, kind of if-def'd in progressively, and then when I had a comfortable solution, just released it accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It looks like it's just been the two of us today. We haven't seemed to gather anyone else. Are there any topics or anything that you wanted to raise?
Probably, but none that I can think of currently.
Very good. I've spent a weekend. My wife is out of town currently. She's down with her parents, and I've spent a weekend recording podcasts, which have just been basically podcast abuse. I recorded a 5-hour-long Stone Ape with Heron on Friday night to set it off.
What a marathon.
Well, it became like a physical challenge thing, which was quite surreal, where one of us had to kind of tap out on the evening. So we got to about 12:40 at night, and I'd gotten up, I think, at 6, and I've been, when my wife goes, she takes the car, so I walk into work. So it's about, I don't know, it's about 3 and a bit kilometres either way. So, you know, I'm getting 7 kilometres worth of walking exercise a day, plus getting up early in order to do the walk to get in. And, yeah, and Heron's the way he is, in terms of his just general level of energy. So by about 12:40, I kind of started to realise I was slowing down at about 10:30, which is normally when we stop. You know, by 11:30, it was just like, what are we even doing here? And I gave an extra long explanation associated with something, and just all went to pot after that. But yeah, I think the whole thing with Heron is very, very strange, because he has these zealots that are his followers from Gendo.
Yes, I think you mentioned it on the podcast.
And they cause trouble. I've had this one guy, he has absolutely no correspondence with me whatsoever, and then I had this one piece of correspondence where he basically states that he's Heron's agent, and I have to do these things, and I just thought, who on earth is this person, you know?
So is Heron Stone regarded as some kind of guru amongst a certain crowd?
I think he would deny that, but he is. And the thing about the crowd that hangs around him is that they're disaffected young men. So he does occasionally have older men and women who are part of the whatever. But the whole zeitgeist thing is just really very curious. And because he basically got a whole lot of zeitgeist people, you have already a kind of born again.
I'm more or less familiar with zeitgeist.
Yeah. I don't know. Anyway. So yeah, it's funny because in doing these more, and now I've actually made it in this distinct thing, because he is recording podcasts, he's just not putting them out. So all his zealots have come over to Stone Ape and don't like what they hear.
Oh dear.
So, yeah, it's just like this strange thing in and of itself, which ultimately I think pollutes because he doesn't remember anything. I mean, so we have the same conversations over and over again, which I find somewhat frustrating. I don't know, I don't get it. I mean, as you listen to Stone Ape, as your general podcast listening goes,
I don't get the impression that it's going around in circles.
You don't?
No.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I'm just not listening hard enough.
I listen to probably, in terms of editing it and putting it out, I would listen to each show at least twice. Some of them I listen to quite frequently just because it's in my rotation. And I don't delete the old ones, which means that it's more frequently in my rotation. Interesting. Okay, so it's not repeating itself. Okay, I'll use that as a barometer. What other podcasts are you listening to currently? I notice you listen to The Sea Realm and...
Oh, I've got quite a laundry list. A lot of them are sort of Linux-related type podcasts or technology-related. So one of the more recent ones was the Dick Turpin Roadshow. Mm-hmm. But I've been a long time listener to things like Linux Outlaws.
Yes.
That sort of thing. The Sunday morning Linux Review.
Do you still listen to Floss Weekly?
I don't think it's on the list currently, but I probably should put it on the list.
Okay, I always thought that you came to Noble Ape through Biota. Did you? Or did
Yes.
you? Okay.
From listening to the Biota podcast, yes.
Okay.
And that was through Steve Grand, from looking at Steve Grand's website.
Okay, so that's the connection. Because you started communicating with me soon after the Floss Weekly stuff, and I just assumed that you'd come in through Floss Weekly, but knew of Steve Grant's work.
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah, I've had great difficulty with Floss Weekly. I think some of them are really good, and I've basically stopped listening to it. I haven't listened to it for probably a couple of years now. It went into some kind of strange spiral where none of it actually made sense. I mean, it was so kind of micro-community that it didn't even make sense to be associated with what applied open source was supposed to be about. I'm still relatively friendly with Randall Schwartz, but I don't know. I mean, I haven't had any meaningful correspondence with him in quite some time, so... Interesting. Did you see, I put up in the Stone Ape feed a video of my book thing beside my bed, and one of the books was a book from the 1950s, which is a children's book not a children's book, it's a pocket information book which is aimed at children on cactus and succulents. Okay. Which I found quite striking because it's, I I've always found cactus and succulents in the UK to be it's a bit like solar in the UK, you know?
Strange combination.
It's a strange combination that doesn't seem to fit in.
Especially north of England, where it's quite cold and not very often sunny.
Yes, yes. But no, it struck me, I mean, I was interested in your father's early introduction to cactus and succulents as being something to, devote a lifetime to.
Right. I think at the time when he was growing up, horticulture was much bigger than it is today.
Certainly.
It would have been the post-war period when a lot of people would have been still interested in sort of back garden subsistence and things like that.
Yeah.
Apparently, gardens and parks were much better kept in those days.
Yeah.
So there was a lot more general interest in plants.
I'm not sure about your area, but when we were in the UK, we had communal gardens across from us that were actually very well maintained.
Right.
It could just be that various parts of the UK have them, various other parts don't. But it was impossible to actually, we were there for 3 and a bit years. They were the locals that had the community garden rights basically probably inherited them in kind of Second World War era periods. And it was impossible to get onto the community garden because of that. But we did, I was very appreciative that particularly because, they were in their 60s and 70s. One of the fellows, our neighbour actually, was he'd been in the merchant navy through the Second World War. And he was where we lived in the UK, we lived in Wilmslow, which is where Turing spent the last 10 years.
Yeah. Did you ever visit Alan Turing's old house?
Yeah, well, I would walk past it.
Right.
So
I went on a little mini pilgrimage to there last year.
Oh, did you? So you've been to Wilmslow?
I have indeed, yes.
Oh, my goodness. And you didn't know that I used to live there?
I don't think so, no.
Oh, what a bore. I would have told you all the stuff to say. No, it's an amazing town. I really, and funnily enough,
and Turing's house is like next to an empty field, and there's like a conservatory area at the back and stuff.
That's exactly where I used to live. That whole area is, and his house is not alone. There are a number of houses around there that are exactly like that. In fact, that's basically where we lived. Yeah,
very middle class sort of area.
Yeah, it is. It's a strange area because your neighbours are the Beckhams, quite fundamentally. Your neighbours are wealthy football people on some regard. In fact, my wife had a run-in with Victoria Beckham and her sister when we lived there. And it is very curious because you're almost run over by Porsches and things like that as you walk around. But within the town itself, a majority of the people are people who've been there for quite a long time, and the elderly population is quite substantial there. Obviously, there are young folk. On my street there was a publicist who I did some work with, but most of the people were at least in their 50s or 60s. It's an area that, they very heavily adopted me, and certainly the folks who maintained the Wilmslow Wikipedia entry still list me as a valued participant in Wilmslow, which was quite fun. But I watch real estate there. I really like that area and would go back and live there in a heartbeat given the right opportunities. Because, I found it has the right combination of city and country as well. What a pity that I hadn't instilled that in your... Because, Wilmslow is just a fascinating... Funnily enough, I have a great aunt. She's not even she married my great uncle after my... Actually, she's my great aunt, but she's not blood relative. She was married... No, we were married in the church, but she grew up in Wilmslow. So she knew the church and the whole area as well. It's an interesting place because you do meet people in the wild, even though it's got a population of like 30,000 or something. You do meet people in the wild that have spent time in Wilmslow, and I've never found a place with more eccentrics. And just interactive eccentrics, not nasty eccentrics that you bump into and have a conversation with, which probably just labels me accordingly as well. But, I found it was just really just an amazing place to live. And, it has all the usual kind of, drunken Friday night, Saturday night, the pavement pizza phenomena, all that kind of stuff. But aside
Yeah.
from that, in terms of the people that live there, it is an area that I do maintain like real estate watch. I could live quite comfortably in a small townhouse in Wilmslow, and really, it's ultimately a place that I would like to, return to at some stage.
Okay.
Because it does enable close proximity to everything that you need, plus also have the ability to walk for, miles through the countryside and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly looked like a very sort of leafy suburbs type area.
Yeah, it's interesting actually because most of it is start of the Industrial Revolution workers' housing.
Okay.
The actual terrace housing that makes up the kind of backbone of Wilmslow where we lived is like that. You do have a couple of, reasonable multi-block kind of manor houses that are through that, but the areas that I look at in terms of real estate are either terraced housing or some of the manor houses you can buy like a quarter, like a top half a floor or something of them. And when we lived there, one of the early places we considered renting from was one of those areas. The other thing is that it's not the south of the UK. Just really, I mean, I've spent nice times along the coast, and I have an uncle who lives in London and is obsessed about London. And I've lived in Leicester as well. But yeah, Wilmslow was just amazing for me. It was also really the start of the kind of rebirth of Noble Ape. I mean, basically, I had a little study room with a window that looked out over a field, and that was my place for starting working on Noble Ape. I would come home from work and, talk to my wife and have a meal, and then I'd spend, an hour and a half writing basically the new Mac interface, which ultimately, Apple picked up as well. But just focused quality time working on Noble Ape on a kind of daily basis, which is an opportunity I didn't really have when I lived here previously, because it was just continuous stuff, other stuff, nonsense. And it was just wonderful. It was luxury. I mean, the job that I had when I was there was not particularly good. The boss I had was not particularly pleasant, and the work was interesting on some level, but just had a whole lot of like institutional problems associated with it.
Yeah.
But the environment was above and beyond anything that I could have wanted, and we had a lot of fun there. I mean, we would, we knew the region pretty well. We'd get out. I mean, it was an easy region to get around on foot or take trains. But it's a pity actually I didn't see your part of the world while I was there. I mean, my father was born in Leeds, and we didn't go to Leeds. In fact, we really missed that whole. I think the Lake District was probably as close as we got to your part of the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly where we were, in terms of weekends and what have you, there were lots of easy getaways. And for the first year we didn't use the National Trust at all. And then after the first year we got a National Trust membership, and we would go to the houses and do things like that on the weekends occasionally. There's some interesting houses, one that's very high walled where they've tried to maintain the flora and fauna from like the 15th century. Which is quite curious. And we bought a lot of seeds from there, which we perhaps illegally imported into the US, and quite comfortably we could grow fruits and herbs through all year in Las Vegas inside, because the genetics were so well suited to low light conditions that Las Vegas, winter, summer, what have you, we could have fresh tomatoes and, basil and all that other stuff quite easily, which was an interesting kind of juxtaposition of genetics. But no, I really liked living in that part of the world, and also to have things like community gardens. Although all these things change. I mean, we haven't been back for 7 years now, and in particular, a lot of the elderly people that made up the town probably are moving into nursing homes or what have you. I mean, I don't know what will. My view is that the wealth component of Wilmslow may take over, but there were always young professionals moving in as well. So I don't know. Our plan was to go back last year, and we don't really have a plan to go back this year. Maybe in the next couple of years we might. I mean, my hope is through some means to actually get back at some time in the near future. But we kind of eliminated when we moved to the San Francisco Bay, the money we have saved for going on holiday was immediately repositioned to looking for a house, which we kind of still continue to do. So yeah, that's been that. But yeah, I have a lot of time for that area and spent a lot of quality. I mean, we spent 3.5 years there, and yeah, it was, aside from the job, it was very well liked time basically. What was your impression of the Hajj that you took to Wilmslow? Did you spend any time in the town? You just got off the train and went there, or what did you do?
Well, I was at a job interview in town, and I'd done my background research on the area, and I'd realised from the I think Andrew Hodges' biography of Turing that he spent time in Wilmslow, and I think that's where he ended his life.
The last 10 years, yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I thought it would be interesting after the interview to try and find Turing's old house. So yeah, so I asked around, including when I was in the interview, whether anybody knew where Turing's house was. And I had a few candidates that I'd found on the internet. So I just kind of perused those 2 or 3 houses, and eventually the last one was the original destination because they had the blue plaque on it.
It's got the plate, yeah. It's hard to... I mean, my view is that if you... I don't even know what the centre of town would be like anymore. There were 2 bookstores in the centre of town, and both of them had done Turing promotions, and they identified the house. One of them actually had a large mural with the house painted in it.
Yeah. It was interesting that the locals that I talked to anyway didn't know where it was and didn't really seem to have any interest. This is including people in the software and computer industry, by the way.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, the nature of the people I worked with, I don't think any of the people I worked with actually lived in Wilmslow.
Right.
So, yeah, I think most of them came in from, like, Crewe, some from Preston. I mean, you know, they came from all parts to come to this company, and no one had relocated to be closer to the company.
Mm-hmm.
But within the locals, I think the bookstores, because they did active promotions, probably could have pointed you in the right direction, or at least sold you a map, as may have been the case.
Possibly, yes. So I didn't spend very long loitering in the area, because it looked fairly middle class, and I would imagine there were a lot of twitching curtains and so on. And it just looked like a private house, so
yeah.
I didn't look too suspicious. It's interesting to see the destination, anyway.
It is a functioning house.
Yeah.
I guess Turing's had a kind of rebirth, particularly since I was out of the UK when the Apology came out. But yeah, it is an interesting thing, kind of maintaining the kind of public mind associated with these kind of figures. And ultimately, I think of this in particular with a Merchant Navy fellow. When they stopped celebrating. They stopped having a Memorial Day acknowledged for the Atlantic while I was in the UK.
Okay.
And yeah, I talked to him about that.
Yeah.
In fact, I didn't even know about that. I just raised it with him, and then that's when he shared it with me that he'd actually been in the Merchant Navy.
From the Turing point of view, it is a bit of an indulgence. I mean, there were plenty of other people around at the time who were also noteworthy. And it just happens that Turing is better known than anybody else. And documentaries often sort of over-egg his part in the whole thing.
Yeah, it pays to be an eccentric character. The general engineers never seem to be remembered, but yes. The difficult ones are remembered somehow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, no, Wilmslow is a central part of my enjoyment of the UK. And I think the quality, you're right, I mean, you know, in general, but I think once you identify, there's probably some self-identification, because people would see me walking around, and I walked everywhere in Wilmslow. I would meet other walkers that would be other probably similar eccentrics, and we would start conversations accordingly, and then the older people in the village would know. It was funny, I had to get something notarized towards the end of my time, and there was a road that you had to cross, and then you got into the nicer houses, which obviously wasn't the side of the street that I was living on. And I went across and had the documents notarized, and the elderly gentleman said, you know, you've come here at the wrong time. This town was so much nicer 20 years ago. And I said, look, compared to the places I've lived, it's really nice currently. And I think there was kind of a mutual exchanging of glances that actually probably the problem that was happening was far too many people, such as myself, that had lived in horrible places, were coming there and polluting the good spirit of the town. But no, we had a lot of fun there, and I think it strengthened me that you could actually have like a community where, I don't know, I mean, the areas that we've lived, I mean, most noticeably Las Vegas, there's just very little community. to the point where your neighbours will be, your neighbours will either be non-acknowledgement or, they'll cause trouble. Yeah, Wilmslow wasn't like that. I mean, I think we felt, because also it was an adventure for both of us. It's the first time Michelle hadn't lived outside the US, hadn't really been outside the US, she'd been to Canada and Mexico, and it really was a...
culture shock.
Not necessarily. Well, initially, yes, but then there's something associated with, hold it, wait, this is actually better. Which is very, very strange, particularly for Americans.
Right. It maybe challenges the narrative a bit.
Exactly. Yeah. And it was funny, actually, when my in-laws came out. My in-laws came out for the wedding, including the sisters and what have you. My wife's grandmother as well. And, it was interesting for them. They didn't spend enough time to have enough experiences. When my wife first arrived in the UK, actually in Wilmslow, just outside of Wilmslow, not in Wilmslow, we were looking at places, and I'd already found the place that we lived in, and she came up and we stayed in one of these they're not even hotels, they're kind of pub with rooms. Her purse was stolen while we were there, and she lost all her currency. I mean, thankfully she didn't have any. Oh, actually, what had they done? No, they'd been through her purse, they'd taken the money, and then they left the purse.
Right.
So that was her early introduction to Wilmslow, or out the outskirts of Wilmslow. But then from there, everything improved dramatically. But yeah, that was one of the strange kind of outside. And funnily enough, I don't think that hotel, but she went to work. She went to work in a hotel that was actually further down the road. And yeah, it was interesting. But no, I really like that part of the world. And it's certainly a place that I could return to. You also have access to, I mean, in terms of all the big things, transport out and in easily, food, doctors, all the things that you need through elderly life. And the fact that there were a whole lot of old people there living quite comfortably when I was last there indicates to me that it could be a nice area to, return to in later life.
Yeah.
Although the weather here is relatively addictive. But aside from that, but no, it's interesting actually to get the sense of an external observer. So you were there for probably half a day at most.
Yes, something like that, yes.
Yeah. Very interesting, Bob. Very interesting. Well, I'll let you get on with your Sunday evening. It's been a pleasure chatting.
Yes.
I'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Yes, okay. Bye now.